One night, two names, millions of lives in the balance. As darkness fell over the Sahel, American satellites locked onto a flicker in the desert, a flare of oil beneath African soil. At the same moment, a sealed cable left Washington. Donald Trump, no longer a president but still wielding power, sent a message across continents. Deliver 90% of your oil and gold within 24 hours, or face the consequences. But this wasn't just a demand, it was a threat. And the man who received it, Ibrahim Traoré, a young African soldier turned leader, didn't blink. He stood in a dim war room, map of his country glowing red, and said 7 words that would shake the world. Tell them, this land is not for sale. This is not just a story of oil and gold. This is a story of resistance, of power, of dignity, and of what happens when a man from the global south says no to the empire of the north. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Ouagadougou, 3:17 a.m. The air was too still for a capital city. Not a single horn, no distant rumble of motorcycles. Just the low hum of electric lights flickering above the corridors of the presidential compound. Lights that felt almost nervous, unsure whether they should stay on or hide in the dark. Deep beneath the main building, a war room carved in concrete and silence stirred to life. A red light blinked, once, twice, then the printer coughed. The paper it spat out was thick, matte, marked with faint watermarks only visible to trained eyes. No one touched it at first. Even the intelligence officer delivering it seemed to hold it like a loaded weapon. Arms stiff, breath shallow, eyes unreadable. Inside the dim chamber, Ibrahim Traoré sat at the head of a long table lined with screens, maps, and blinking nodes. He wore no medals, no presidential sash, just a desert-tone fatigues jacket, rolled sleeves, and the kind of stare that suggested he'd been awake for more than one night and carried more than one burden. The officer placed the document before him and left the room. No sound, just that paper, and the low ticking of a wall clock that suddenly felt uncomfortably loud. Traoré's fingers moved slowly, tracing the red markings before reading aloud. Deliver 90% of your oil and gold in 24 hours, or face consequences. DJ Trump. There it was, no diplomacy, no discussion, no attempt at subtlety, just a line carved with the sharpness of empire, a sentence heavy enough to break lesser men. But Traoré didn't move. Not yet. The only shift was in the air. The kind of pressure change animals feel before lightning strikes. The room seemed to lean in, waiting for him to blink, to breathe, to flinch. He didn't. Outside the bunker, the streets of Ouagadougou slept in layers of dust and moonlight. But inside this concrete shell, the storm had already begun. Traoré leaned back, not in disbelief but in thought. His right hand brushed over the edge of the document like he was reading not just words, but history itself. Because to him, this wasn't the first letter. This was just the latest chapter in a pattern written long before his name ever made the news. Flash, a memory, a boy, no older than 10, running barefoot through a field, scorched by sun and hunger. A father coughing in a dry shack, oil maps on the wall, never paid for. French accents in the air, promises left in empty envelopes. That boy had learned something early. Deals with empires were written in blood, not ink. Back in the present, the map on the wall lit up, pulsing slowly. Gold mines, oil corridors, communications towers. A nation that had, until now, stayed quiet, maybe too quiet, about what lay beneath its soil. Now the world knew, and the world wanted. Suddenly, a sharp tone from the secure comms line, a flicker of movement on one of the surveillance screens, a U.S. drone repositioning, just a nudge over the eastern corridor. Someone was watching, someone was waiting. Traoré rose, the letter still in hand. He walked slowly toward the center of the war room. Not hurried, not shaken, each step measured, deliberate. He looked up at the screen showing the oil flare discovered just weeks ago, still officially non-existent on international maps. They knew, he said quietly. They were watching before we even drilled. One of his aides, younger, anxious, cleared his throat. "Mr. President, what should we—" But Traoré cut him off with a glance. Then he turned to the head of military command and said calmly, without raising his voice, "Tell Washington, this land is not for sale." Silence, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was charged. The way silence feels before the first thunderclap. And so it begins. Somewhere across the Atlantic, Donald Trump checks his phone. Somewhere over the Sahel, a predator drone silently begins to orbit. And somewhere deep inside every Burkinabe watching this story unfold, something ancient begins to stir. Not fear, not anger, but memory and fire. The silence that followed Traoré's declaration wasn't void. It was purposeful. It lingered like smoke in a battlefield, thick with weight, heavy with meaning. Inside the war room, the glow of surveillance screens washed his face in pale blue as he stood alone. Letter still in hand, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the concrete walls. But his stillness wasn't hesitation. It was calculation. Discipline honed not in palaces but in the dust and chaos of forgotten lands. Because long before he was president, Ibrahim Traoré was a soldier. And before that, he was just a barefoot boy with cracked heels and calloused palms, raised in a village the maps never bothered to name. Back then, the sky over his home was the same scorched canvas it was now. But he remembered how it felt when foreign choppers hovered overhead, how the goats scattered, how children stopped playing and ran to hide under woven mats, how even his mother's breath caught each time the wind changed. He had been 10 when his father handed him a folded newspaper, its corners worn soft by many readings. On the front page, a headline from the capital: "Foreign companies sign 30-year mineral deal with former colony." Beneath it, a photo of smiling men in suits, none of them Burkinabe. His father had simply said, "One day someone has to say no." That sentence had carved itself into him. It echoed in every boot he laced, every gun he cleaned, every order he followed, and sometimes questioned. By the time he was 17, he had joined the national military. Not for glory, not for power, for clarity, for a sense of where the truth stood when bullets started flying. They called him Le Capitaine Calm, the calm captain, not because he lacked fire, but because he knew exactly when to let it burn. Now, years later, that same boy, the one who'd watched his village water pump rust while gold was shipped off in armored trucks, stood at the center of a room that could change the fate of a continent. No crown, no pomp, no teleprompters, just the weight of a nation in his chest and an ultimatum in his hand. He turned to the intercom. "Summon Commander Sanu and Director Wenda. Now." The aide nodded and disappeared without a word. Within minutes, boots clicked against tile. Commander Mamadou Sanu entered first, shoulders squared, the kind of man who had served long enough to forget how to smile. Traoré respected him because Sanu never asked why when orders came, only how soon. Director Wenda followed, wiry and alert, eyes sharp beneath thin glasses, always smelling faintly of old books and cigarettes. He carried secrets like other men carried prayer beads, always at hand, never spoken of. The three men stood without ceremony as they had so many times before, in darker, dustier tents with less at stake. Traoré didn't waste words. He held up the letter. They want it, all of it, 90%. Sano's jaw clenched. Wendy's eye twitched, but neither spoke. They gave us 24 hours. He let the silence breathe, just enough to let the absurdity sink in. "Gentlemen," he said, voice low but steady, "we've all bled for this land. We've all buried friends whose names never made the papers. And now they want to buy what we were born into, at gunpoint, with contracts." His eyes scanned them both. Not for approval, but for alignment. No summit, no signatures, no delay. Then, with all the calm of a man stating fact, he delivered the line again. But this time, not for the walls, for history. "Tell Washington, this land is not for sale." And this time, neither man blinked. They simply nodded, turned, and left to carry out the order. Because they knew, just as he did, once you say no to an empire, there's no turning back, only forward, through the storm. Half a world away in a beige-lit operations center just outside Langley, Virginia, A red icon blinked twice on a wall-sized screen and then vanished. A low beep followed, a signal barely above ambient noise, but enough to make the technician on duty sit upright. He keyed in a diagnostic and frowned, then frowned again. "Secure link in Ouagadougou just went dark," he said without looking away from the screen. The supervisor leaned over his shoulder. "Reboot it." "I did. It's not down. It's been shut." The silence that followed was not technical. It was instinctive. Across the ocean in Paris, inside a narrow building with no nameplate, an intelligence analyst noticed something similar. The satellite relay over Burkina Faso had rerouted its feed. French civilian contractors, usually invisible to such operations, were suddenly geo-blocked from viewing high-resolution imagery of the Eastern Corridor. The only footage available now was low-res, 3 hours delayed. The analyst looked to his superior and muttered, "Either they're hiding something or they're getting ready." Back in Ouagadougou, the first unmanned surveillance drone, an American-built MQ-9 Reaper, leased discreetly through an Allied base, subtly adjusted its flight path. A 6-degree course correction, no more. Just enough to bring the southern refinery zone into clearer focus. No press coverage, no flags, but the eye had turned. Inside the U.S. Embassy, a late-night strategy meeting was called in hushed tones. The ambassador wasn't present. He was still at a dinner reception. But his second-in-command, a former NATO field strategist, paced a narrow room, tie loosened, watching real-time satellite telemetry blink red and gray on a handheld tablet. "They're going dark," he said, "which means something's waking up." In embassies across the capital, phones began ringing, but the voices on the other end had no answers, just questions. Who authorized the lockdown? Why was French mining staff being denied access to their own sites? Why had the Ministry of Energy stopped returning calls? From the outside, Burkina Faso still looked asleep. But from inside the hidden halls of power, something had shifted. The air no longer hummed with routine. It pulsed. At the presidential compound, encryption protocols cycled to level 5. Only 3 people now had full visibility on all state defense grids. Civilian communication towers were placed on passive scan, ready to shut at the flick of a code. Surveillance drones, the country's own, mostly Iranian-modified quadcopters, were lifted into silent holding patterns, high above the oil flares and golden veins of the nation. In a storage unit beneath the National Broadcast Tower, engineers loaded pre-scripted content into emergency channels. Historic speeches, sovereignty declarations, the national anthem looped 5 times over. They weren't expecting peace. They were preparing for narrative war. And somewhere between all these quiet moves and silent watches, a truth burned beneath the noise. Traoré hadn't just said no, he'd lit a fuse. The kind that doesn't explode immediately, but whispers through walls, across cables, through embassies into war rooms, until one day it reaches something volatile and turns the whole map red. At 38,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, the cabin of the private Gulfstream G650 felt more like a strategy bunker than an aircraft. The cabin lights were dimmed to a calculated glow, casting long shadows over leather seats and polished wood, while the steady hum of jet engines served as the soundtrack to something far more volatile than air travel. A long mahogany table stretched down the center of the cabin, cluttered not with champagne flutes or briefing folders, but with satellite images, oil field schematics, and red-marked diplomatic memos. Donald J. Trump sat at the head of the table, not in a suit, but in a custom-made bomber jacket bearing the crest of a now-defunct government branch, one that still gave him access in the places that mattered. His phone screen glowed with encrypted chats, redacted PDFs, and economic forecasts laced with fear. He was no longer president of the United States, but he had never really stopped playing the role, not in his mind and certainly not in the rooms that mattered. Now he operated outside the boundaries of state, no longer restrained by bureaucracy, by advisors or laws. Now he answered only to one thing, his will. Across from him sat a rotund man in a navy suit, sweating beneath the collar. He was a lobbyist turned liaison, the kind of fixer who could speak 5 languages but had no soul left in any of them. His voice trembled slightly as he gestured to a printed document showing Burkina Faso's eastern corridor. A bright red flare blinked on the map. Mr. Trump, this is the confirmed thermal signature. It's a full-scale petroleum anomaly, undocumented, off-grid. No Western syndicate signed to it. The, the zone's been locked down since 0200 GMT. Trump didn't respond. His gaze remained on a single black and white photo, a grainy satellite capture of Ibrahim Traoré, mid-step outside a concrete structure, expression unreadable, posture unbothered. That's the one? Trump asked flatly. Yes, sir. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, interim leader, military background, popular among local youth, anti-Western leanings, very Sankara-esque, charismatic but unpredictable. Trump leaned back, the leather creaking beneath him. He hated unpredictability. It didn't fit the brand. It didn't bow to leverage. And yet here it was, a soldier in a sand-choked nation, daring to challenge the old order. He reached for a Diet Coke, cracked the tab, then turned to his private assistant, a sharp-faced woman with eyes like flint. Tell me what we control. She scrolled through a digital dashboard. Energy contracts, currency bonds, rare earth logistics. 70% of regional supply chains are still under friendly jurisdiction. But Traoré's movement is disruptive. It's triggering sympathy nodes. Sympathy nodes? In Africa and online. TikTok, Reddit, even Bloomberg ran a piece. They're calling it a sovereignty strike. Trump's fingers tapped the table, slow and deliberate. His ego didn't bruise easily, but it bruised deep. He had spent decades building an image of dominance, deals, power, control. And here was this no-name captain rewriting headlines without even entering a boardroom. Have the think tanks started pushing back? Lightly. Most are waiting for your signal. Then give them one. He stood and walked to the rear of the cabin where a camera crew, his own media cell, was always on standby. Not state-funded, but privately loyal, personally compensated. A red standby light blinked as the lens adjusted. He faced the camera. This is what happens when rogue leaders steal what belongs to the world, he said, slow and sharp. This isn't about Africa. This is about order, about keeping terrorists, anarchists, and socialists from destabilizing markets. He paused, staring straight through the lens. And trust me, they won't like what comes next. Cut. The assistant sent the clip to 3 think tanks, 2 network producers, and a private Telegram group known only by its code name, Platinum Grid, a cartel of resource strategists with influence stretching from Wall Street to Whitehall. Back in the cockpit, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom. ETA to Lisbon, 42 minutes. We're cleared for descent. Trump nodded but didn't sit. His mind wasn't in Lisbon. It was in the Sahel, because he hadn't expected resistance. Not like this. Not from someone so young, so unknown. But now it was personal. The elevator hissed open and delivered Traoré back into the command bunker, a cavern of concrete and cold air thrumming with generator noise. Since the cable had arrived, the room had changed color. The usual blues and greens of routine monitoring were now slashed with rolling crimson. On the main screen, every oil well in the eastern corridor pulsed red. Each beat synced to a siren that no one dared silence. Smaller monitors tracked gold shipment routes, pipeline junctions, and the thin fiber strands that carried the nation's secrets through the ground. Each strand, too, flashed red. Traoré moved to the center table, palm hovering over a holographic map. Overlay civilian grids, he said. In an instant, white lines, roads, rails, river crossings, spidered across the red. He watched them breathe like living veins. Then he tapped a single icon. Lock. All white lines grayed out, pixelated, and vanished. Zone status? He asked. Commander Sanu answered without looking up from his tablet. Civilian traffic halted on Corridor East. Rail checkpoints sealed. We've grounded all charter aircraft within a 200-kilometer radius. Drone patrols are airborne. 3 Iranian scouts, altitude 2,000. We're jamming commercial satellites on a rotating schedule. 30-second windows so no one notices the gap. Director Wendt added, Comms blackout is live for foreign devices. Anyone trying to stream video from within the oil fields gets static. We'll feed them pre-recorded footage. Cows grazing, kids playing football, nothing useful. He allowed himself half a smile. Let the analysts scroll for ghosts. Traoré's gaze stayed on the map. Red pulses aligned along the Barun pipeline, an artery that, until last year, carried 3 million barrels a month to a French-owned refinery across the border. Tonight, that refinery would wait in vain. He tapped another icon. Storage depots lit up like coals. Secure these, Traoré said. No trucks in or out until we verify every driver. Sanu's men relayed orders. In the oil belt, searchlights sliced through dawn haze as armed patrols waved 18-wheelers to the shoulder, checking manifests against a blacklist that suddenly stretched 50 pages long. Drivers protested. Rifles settled the matter. In a remote control tower near the Ghanaian frontier, an air traffic controller blinked when his radar feed froze for 15 seconds, then returned -3 blips. Corporate survey planes rerouted by spoofed coordinates. He cursed the system, but filed no report. The glitch would go unnoticed until morning, which was exactly the plan. Back in the bunker, Traoré studied the goldfields. 67 open-pit sites, most of them leased to Canadian or Australian firms. He drew a fingertip across the map, connecting them into a crimson web. "Activate Sovereignty Force," he said. "I want a squad at every exit gate by dawn. No ore leaves this country without military escort. Contractors will complain. Let them." A fresh alert chimed. Wenda glanced at a side monitor. "France just boosted satellite bandwidth. They're suspecting a blackout." "Rotate the jammer frequency," Traoré replied. "Keep them guessing." Another officer in headset called out, "Sir, BBC Africa requesting comment on rumored troop movements." "Silence," Traoré said. "They'll hear our story when it's ready." For a moment he let the hum of machines fill the room. Every red pulse on the map was a heartbeat of the nation, one he refused to surrender for signatures on foreign paper. He thought of his father's words decades ago about someone finally saying no. Well, no had been spoken. Now came the steel behind the syllable. Sanu looked up. "All corridors are sealed, Mr. President. If anyone wants our oil tonight, they'll need an army." Traoré's eyes remained glass calm, but a spark kindled behind them, less anger than certainty. He turned to the wall of maps, to the men who waited on his word, and to the future that would judge this hour. "This isn't diplomacy," he said, voice low yet resonant, carrying farther than any shout. "This is defense." And with that, the bunker erupted into motion. Screens scrolling commands, radios crackling with new call signs, a nation's lifeblood encased in steel and silence. While beyond the compound walls, the first pale light of dawn broke over a country no longer willing to be quiet. Inside the secure basement of CIA headquarters in Langley, a red folder passed from hand to hand, each recipient frowning deeper than the last. The cover was stamped AES High Risk Strategic Shift. Contagion potential, severe. No one had used the word contagion outside of pandemic context in years. But this time, it didn't refer to a virus. It referred to an idea, and it was spreading fast. At the center of it all was a single phrase in bold: "Sovereign anomaly detected, Burkina Faso." The anomaly wasn't military in the conventional sense. There were no nuclear launches, no direct attacks on embassies, but the intel was unsettling. Simultaneous blackouts of commercial satellite links, disruption of drone surveillance routes, unconfirmed reports of nationalized gold exports. And now, this was the part no one had predicted, whispers that foreign intelligence teams had been denied re-entry into resource zones they once moved through freely. The agency's Africa desk chief leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. This isn't just a tactical lockdown. They're rewriting protocol in real time. Another analyst muttered, "It's like they planned for this." Months ago. Meanwhile, in a glass-towered boardroom at Chevron's Houston headquarters, the emergency lights had kicked in. 12 executives sat beneath projection screens streaming satellite imagery, or what was left of it. A large section of West Africa had gone dark in their real-time monitoring grid. Not a blackout, a deliberate blank spot. The new oil flare they'd spotted in northern Burkina Faso had stopped transmitting data less than 24 hours after it was detected. A younger analyst tapped through a slideshow. We had exploratory discussions with intermediaries 2 months ago. Now all communication lines are frozen. No shipping manifests, no customs logs, no third-party confirmations. The CFO raised a brow. And this Traoré? What's his play? Silence, then a quiet voice from legal. He's not playing. Outside the room, legal teams scrambled to review stalled joint ventures. 1 million barrels worth of projected Q4 profit now sat in limbo. One regional consultant, previously embedded in Ouagadougou, had gone silent. His last message? A single line of text. It's not just oil anymore. In Brussels, NATO's Situational Alert Center escalated Burkina Faso from monitor to escalation watch. A flurry of encrypted messages circled between France, the US, and regional EU partners. The French defense attaché warned of strategic realignment across the Sahel. What worried them wasn't just what Traoré had done. It was how fast he'd done it. With zero foreign oversight and total public support, at least from what they could tell. Then came the kicker. From Accra to Bamako, new hashtags were beginning to trend. Hashtag not for sale, hashtag sovereign soil, hashtag Traoresis. One NATO observer put it plainly, it's moving beyond politics. This is becoming cultural, emotional, viral, and that's what no one had prepared for. They expected diplomatic friction, maybe a few closed borders and harsh words at the UN. But not this. Not a full-scale ideological rupture, engineered from inside a country the world used to ignore. The West had seen rebellions, coups, resource nationalism. But what was happening now in Burkina Faso didn't fit into any of their models. Because this time, there was no puppet, no panic, no foreign negotiator flown in under cover of night. Just a captain-turned-president standing behind sealed doors, building something too quiet to stop and too powerful to ignore. And somewhere, across every diplomatic desk and oil boardroom, one chilling truth began to settle. Burkina Faso had not just closed its gates, it had changed the rules. Before the sun rose over the rooftops of Ouagadougou, before the birds began their morning songs, before soldiers finished lacing their boots, they came. Not in a march, not in anger, not in chance, but in quiet, deliberate steps, with bundles balanced on heads and resolve in their spines. Mothers, grandmothers, widows, women who had known the sound of helicopters before they had known the sound of cell phones. Women who had survived famines, coups, in the silence of international indifference. They didn't wait for instructions. They didn't wait for approval. They just moved. Along the dirt paths that led from outer villages, down the broken roads that curved toward the capital, they came in small groups at first. 2, then 4, then 10. Word spread the old way, through whispers at water pumps and glances exchanged in market stalls. By instinct alone, they understood what was coming, even if no one said it aloud. The storm wasn't on its way. It had already begun. Their arms were full, not with weapons, but with offerings. Jugs of rice, tins of shea butter, packs of gauze, dried fish wrapped in old newspapers, bundles of dried herbs and firewood. A few carried handwritten notes, scribbled prayers, old photographs of sons who had once worn the same fatigues now being issued again from armories across the city. They reached the first military barracks at the edge of the city, just as the sky turned gray-blue. The guards, young conscripts barely out of school, watched in silence as the women approached, not with fear, but with awe. They stepped aside without needing orders. One elderly woman, wrapped in indigo cloth faded nearly white, placed a basket at the foot of the gate and looked a soldier in the eye. Her voice was barely a whisper. "We feed those who defend us." No cameras recorded the moment. No journalist stood nearby to ask for quotes. But inside the walls, men hardened by war and long nights took the baskets with quiet hands, some swallowing lumps in their throats that had nothing to do with hunger. In other parts of the city, similar scenes unfolded. At a garrison near the old railway, 20 women arrived with pots of millet and bowls of groundnut stew. They didn't ask to speak to any commander. They simply sat, served, and prayed in silence beneath a neem tree. Some hummed lullabies too old for lyrics, melodies born from before the borders were drawn. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't politics. It was ancestral memory moving through modern times. At the Central Military Hospital, where preparations for triage had begun in anticipation of foreign retaliation, a group of midwives arrived with their own supplies, rubbing alcohol, surgical thread, and jars of local honey known to seal wounds when antibiotics ran low. One of them, a woman who had helped deliver more than 1,000 babies in her life, looked at the exhausted chief medic and said, "If they break your bones, we will mend them. If they poison you, we will cleanse you, but they will not bury you." By mid-morning, news of the women had spread through military channels, not as a command, but as a whisper. Units miles apart began sending quiet acknowledgments, short encrypted messages marked only by a single phrase. Les mères sont venues. The mothers have come. There was no policy to respond to this, no protocol in any training manual. But morale, that intangible currency so easily lost in war, rose like a tide. And for Traoré, watching from his compound as reports came in, it meant more than all the surveillance data and drone feeds combined. The people weren't just watching anymore. They were participating, not in revolt, but in resistance. Not with fists, but with food. Because when the women come, uninvited, unarmed, unwavering, it means the land itself has chosen a side, and it will not go quietly. The university campus in Ouagadougou had always buzzed with energy, but this morning the hum was different. It wasn't the sound of students rushing to classes or debating theories in open-air halls. It was organized chaos, whispers turning into plans, ideas becoming action. Under a makeshift canopy built from classroom chalkboards and torn tarps, a group of student leaders huddled around a whiteboard. There were no political slogans, no megaphones, no fiery speeches. Instead, columns and checklists, delivery routes, night watch rotations, fuel rations, translation teams. "Forget the protests," one engineering student said firmly. "We don't need to march. We need to function. Like a machine." They were not idealists. Not anymore. Not after seeing their own government block oil exports overnight or watching elders deliver rice to military barracks without being asked. These were young men and women trained in computer science, logistics, agriculture, urban planning, now repurposing their knowledge for survival, for sovereignty. One corner of the student center had been transformed into a communication hub. Laptops powered by backup batteries hummed as volunteers worked to translate the president's defiant speech. "This land is not for sale," into over a dozen regional dialects: Mossi, Fulfulde, Bisa, Dagara, even rare ones like Gurunsi and Samo. The idea was simple. Every Burkinabe, regardless of language, deserved to understand the moment they were living through. Another group posted up beside a chalk-drawn map of the country, marking out food supply lines to remote villages. Students from farming backgrounds reached out to family contacts, organizing harvest pickups. They coordinated schedules with city taxi drivers who had begun rerouting their normal jobs, offering free rides to soldiers, nurses, and anyone delivering aid. "I'll skip classes for the rest of the year," one economics major said, crossing off a village name. "But I won't skip this history." Meanwhile, in the river town of Kumasi, young fishermen pulled their canoes ashore. They didn't wait for government orders. They just knew. Bundles of dried fish were packed, sorted, and labeled for inland delivery. These weren't formal donations. There were no press cameras or red crosses. They simply moved, because they felt the shift like pressure in the wind. In one urban district, a group of high schoolers, too young to vote but not too young to understand, organized evening patrols. They didn't carry weapons, just flashlights, whistles, and printed ID tags showing the Burkinabe flag. Their mission was simple: keep the alleyways safe, watch for suspicious movement, protect the elders. At the edge of the city, an architecture student led a team that had studied civil engineering. They examined bridges and road choke points, identifying areas most likely to be targeted if foreign forces ever made a move. "Defense is not just about guns," she said, measuring angles with chalk and string. "It's about structure, movement, anticipation. The energy wasn't loud, but it was potent. It spread like heat from a coal bed, slow, controlled, impossible to extinguish once lit. What started in lecture halls now poured into neighborhoods, bus stops, barber shops. Even underground music collectives joined in, recording remixes of Traoré's speech, layering it with trap beats, sharing it across WhatsApp groups that reached not only Burkina Faso, but Mali, Niger, Ghana. No one appointed these students. No one issued orders. And yet everything moved like someone had. Because that someone was not a man. It was a moment. One that finally told them, "This is yours. Take care of it." By late afternoon, someone spray painted the side of an abandoned bus parked outside the university gates. We don't protest. We prepare. And beside it, smaller but bolder, history doesn't ask for permission. From rooftops to riverbanks, from classrooms to city alleys, the youth moved not to be seen, but to ensure their country stayed standing long enough to be remembered. Because empires fall, politicians change, but when a generation awakens, everything burns brighter. Far from the heat and haze of Ouagadougou, in a dim, sea-salted radio booth in Kingston, Jamaica, an old DJ leaned into the mic with a quiet reverence. His fingers hovered over a glowing green play button for a moment longer than usual, as if he were offering a prayer. Then with a soft click, the airwaves filled with Ibrahim Traoré's voice, steady, sharp, unwavering. "This land is not for sale." The words echoed across the Caribbean like an ancestral drum beat, low and insistent. The station played it again, then again. Every hour, on the hour. The host said little else. He didn't need to. For older Jamaicans, it stirred memories of Garvey. For the youth, it sounded like the revolution they'd been promised and never received. In kitchens, taxis, and street corners, people paused, not just to listen, but to absorb. It didn't feel foreign, it felt familiar. Thousands of miles away in Hackney, East London, the movement took form in color. A mural appeared overnight on the side of a weather-worn brick building, once tagged with grime and forgotten names. Now it bore Traoré's likeness, bold and defiant, eyes fixed forward. In one hand he held the Constitution of Burkina Faso, in the other a redacted letter stamped with DJ Trump. Above his head in stark black lettering, "We said no." The artist never claimed it, but the message claimed space in everyone's mind. Within hours, passers-by were stopping to take photos, children asking who the man was, and elders nodding silently. Recognition in their eyes. On nearby walls, other phrases began to appear. "Africa is not your mine. You fear our silence. You'll dread our voice." Further south in Lusaka, Zambia, a group of young digital artists, coders, and designers gathered in a repurposed warehouse turned creative lab. The atmosphere was electric, not frantic, but intentional. On their screens, they blended heritage symbols with sleek, defiant typography. The most shared poster of the day was simple, a black silhouette of Burkina Faso, wrapped in gold bars and oil pipes, being cut free by a single machete. Across the bottom, "Not for sale." The image spread like wildfire. Within 12 hours, it had been translated into Swahili, Xhosa, Amharic, Hausa. Not by corporations or NGOs, but by students, translators, and diaspora networks who hadn't collaborated in years, if ever. A decentralized unity was forming, not dictated by treaties or press statements, but by instinct. In Nairobi, spoken word poets took to open mics to recite reimagined versions of Traoré's words. In Accra, a gospel choir released a choral version of his declaration. In Dakar, tailors stitched "Not for sale" into sashes worn by market women. In Port of Spain, steel pan musicians composed a rhythm named the Captain's March. None of it was orchestrated, none of it was organized, and yet it felt orchestrated by something deeper, a shared exhaustion, a collective memory, an invisible wire that connected struggle to purpose across oceans and borders. Because Traoré hadn't just declared resistance, he had given language to something unspoken, a yearning, decades old, to own more than land, to own destiny. And in that rare, electrified pause between defiance and retaliation, a continent didn't just rise. It held its breath, not out of fear, but because, for the first time in a long, long while, it knew exactly who it was. The runways at Ouagadougou's secondary airstrip were never designed for history. Faded tarmac, no towers, no press vans, just rusting hangars and a night so still it seemed to listen. But tonight, under a moon sliced thin like a blade, 3 military aircraft cut across the Sahel sky, descending without radio chatter, without transponders, no flags, no diplomatic clearances filed. Only coordinates shared by encrypted channels, hand to hand, like the secrets of an old resistance. The first to land was a dark gray turboprop, bearing no insignia. From its bay emerged Colonel Assimi Goïta of Mali, boots crunching softly against the gravel. His eyes scanned the horizon the way only a soldier's do, not for cameras but for cover. No bodyguards flanked him, just his presence, heavy with calm force. Minutes later, a second aircraft touched down, sleek, sand-colored, still warm from desert winds. General Abdourahmane Tchiani of Niger stepped out with his signature walk, shoulders squared, face unreadable, hands empty but deliberate. He adjusted nothing. Not his uniform, not his pace. He simply moved like a man who knew why he was here and why it mattered. The third arrived just before 3 a.m., a modified Russian Ilyushin, darker than the night it slipped through. From its hatch descended Colonel Mamadi Doumbouya of Guinea, taller than the others with arms like steel cables and a stare that didn't seek approval. His stride was unhurried, his demeanor unshaken. He carried a small, leather-bound notebook in one hand. No electronics. Just pages. Just thoughts. There were no greetings beyond nods. No red carpets. No protocol officers fumbling with scripts. Only a single Burkinabe officer, standing at the edge of the landing zone, offering a silent salute. The 3 men walked side by side into the armored convoy that would take them directly to the presidential compound. Not the front entrance, but through a service gate, locked from within and guarded not by cameras, but by loyalty. Inside, the lights were low. A long table waited, surrounded by screens, none recording. Traoré stood at the head, not in a suit, but in the same worn fatigues from the bunker, boots dusted, sleeves rolled. He didn't walk forward to greet them. He waited, because what stood before him were not guests. They were equals. Goïta stepped forward first. There was no handshake, only a single phrase. "You held the line." Traoré nodded once. "So did you." Tchiani added, "We've been watching." "Listening. You didn't blink." Doumbouya said nothing. Instead, he stepped closer, looked Traoré in the eye, and offered his arm, forearm to forearm, warrior's grip. Traoré clasped it. A pause, then the other 2 joined. Forearms locked together in a silent square. A symbol older than their uniforms. A pact forged in necessity, not pageantry. The room was still. Then slowly, they sat. There were no minutes to be taken, no translators, no opening remarks. What followed was not negotiation, it was alignment. They spoke of logistics, of satellite interference, of border airspace corridors, of which roads would need reinforcement, of which towns were vulnerable to sabotage. They mapped weak points not just in geography, but in information, finance, narrative. They shared names of infiltrators, contractors with questionable loyalties, signal patterns from foreign drones. No posturing, no abstractions, just details, the kind spoken in low tones by men who have seen what happens when the wrong decisions are made too late. By the time the first call to prayer rang across Ouagadougou, the meeting was over. There were no press statements, no photos released, no tweet threads declaring unity. Only a new signal encrypted and sent out from the heart of the compound. AES, active. 3 letters, now more than an acronym. They were a shield, a doctrine, a promise. Because what had been written in silence tonight would ring loudly tomorrow, across the Sahel, across Africa, across the fragile table of global power. There were no fireworks, no fanfare. But every satellite that passed over Burkina Faso that morning caught a signal it couldn't decrypt, coming from a country it couldn't control, led by 4 men it couldn't buy. And that was enough to make every embassy wake up early, because the map had changed. And somewhere in its new shape, an empire had just lost its grip. By sunrise, what had been agreed in shadows moved swiftly into action. There were no ceremonies, no anthems, no flags fluttering in slow motion. But across the dry earth of the Sahel, a silent system began to activate, piece by piece, signal by signal. A machine of defense built not from metal, but from memory, trust, and fire. The AES alliance, until now little more than a concept passed around in diplomatic cables and analyst briefings, had come alive, and it wasn't asking for permission. Inside the presidential compound, a secure control room was repurposed within hours. Burkina Faso's internal military systems, once siloed for national use, were now being linked via AES encrypted comms channels to command centers in Bamako, Niamey, and Conakry. Engineers from all three countries worked shoulder to shoulder, stripping protocols down to essentials and rebuilding them with resilience in mind. No Western cloud servers, no satellite links vulnerable to NATO interception. The system was built on mesh networks hardened by Russian frequency jamming countermeasures and Chinese routing algorithms, passed quietly between allies in recent months. It wasn't pretty, but it was unbreakable. In a control tent near the Burkina-Niger border, a young officer adjusted a joystick on a newly calibrated drone console. The screen displayed a sweeping arc of territory, normally a lawless buffer zone. Now it pulsed with activity. Drones outfitted with infrared and acoustic sensors had begun continuous patrols, flying low enough to avoid foreign radar, high enough to remain untouchable from ground fire. Each aircraft was tagged with a rotating digital ID, scrambled every 12 minutes across borders. A drone that took off in Mali could land in Guinea without broadcasting the same signature twice. AES had not just shared its skies, it had made them indistinguishable. In Bamako, a secure hangar was open, where transport craft were being refitted for emergency humanitarian and military use. At least 5 aircraft were already designated for inter-capital supply routes. What had once been complex diplomatic airspace was now unlocked by mutual sovereignty. Within hours, emergency air corridors were plotted and cleared between the capitals. Ouagadougou to Bamako, Bamako to Niamey, Niamey to Conakry, Conakry to Ouagadougou. A circular lifeline drawn through heat and sand. One AES logistics commander leaned over a topographical map and whispered, "If they try to cut off one artery, another flows faster." The machine didn't need permission to survive. It had already been born from threat. At the central AES coordination center in Ouagadougou, a heavily shielded underground floor previously used only for civil defense drills, a rotating tri-command structure was established. Each nation contributed one commanding officer with joint decision authority. Rotations would occur every 72 hours. No rank superiority, no national bias. Just function, just unity. General Sanao, now serving as Burkina Faso's liaison to the AES Military Council, stepped to a secure microphone. His voice transmitted simultaneously to all 3 capitals. Stage 1 coordination complete. Borders monitored, comms secure, drones operational, awaiting diplomatic reaction. From the other side, Goita responded, not with bureaucratic language, but with the clarity of a soldier. "Touch one," he said, voice steady through the static. "You touch all." In that moment, a doctrine crystallized, not written on paper, but embedded in the new infrastructure. AES was not just an agreement. It was a shield system, built in silence, designed for impact. And now it was humming. International observers, still waking up to the implications of the night before, were stunned by the speed of coordination. One EU analyst in Brussels blinked at his screen, muttering, "They've created a joint response zone. This isn't rebellion, it's architecture." But inside the alliance, no one stopped to celebrate. There was no time. Every kilometer of reinforced communication was one less opportunity for sabotage. Every synchronized drone path was a layer of armor against the storm they all knew would come. AES wasn't just united, it was operational. It began with a single t-shirt, white cotton, hand-pressed ink, a silhouette of 4 men standing shoulder to shoulder, Traoré, Goita, Chiani, Doumbouya. Above the words, "Not for sale, not alone." It appeared one morning on the back of a street vendor in Ouagadougou, By midday, 3 more in Niamey. By sundown, hundreds across Bamako, where the message didn't just spread, it erupted. Walls once covered in old political posters and layers of city dust were now repainted in bold defiance. Graffiti artists worked overnight, spraying murals of the AES map stretched like a shield across the Sahel. In fiery red across a downtown bridge in Bamako, touch one, you touch all. But the loudest expression of unity came not in paint, but in feet. Students marched, not in chaos, but in rhythm. Columns of youth moving like waves through the city streets, each wearing the same shirt, each bearing the same expression. Not rage, not joy, but conviction. They didn't block traffic, they moved with it. Taxi drivers honked in rhythm, street drummers joined from sidewalks. Grandmothers from balconies dropped bottles of water in plastic bags to fuel the movement below. No official permit had been requested. No one waited for one. In front of the University of Bamako, where protests in the past had crumbled into confusion, something different happened. A student stepped forward, held up a megaphone, and said simply, "This is no longer about Burkina. This is about all of us." And the chant began, soft at first, then louder, stronger. AES or death. AES or death. AES or death. It rolled through the capital like thunder without rain. And it didn't stop there. In rural Mali, village elders carved the letters AES into wooden doors with iron nails. In Niger's markets, tailors stitched the phrase into waistbands of uniforms sold to truck drivers and watchmen. In Guinea's capital, school children chanted it at recess, not even fully understanding the weight of the words, only that they mattered and that they were theirs. Social media boiled with energy. The chant was turned into a trap beat in Lagos, into a call and response rhythm in Dakar, into a whispered prayer in Swahili, shared by students at a university in Dar es Salaam. Even the diaspora began to stir. In Paris, African shopkeepers placed handwritten signs in their windows, AES welcome here. In New York, a group of Pan-African activists projected a live feed of the Sahel skyline onto the side of a Harlem apartment building, looping Traoré's speech between clips of Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah. And across all of it, pulsing like a heartbeat through every message, mural, and march, was the unspoken realization. For the first time, Africa had a shield, not one made of steel or sanctioned by the UN, not drawn by colonial borders or fragile peacekeeping pacts, but a shield made of fire. Fire from rejection, fire from memory, fire from finally saying no and meaning it. The kind of fire that, once lit, doesn't just defend, it spreads. It didn't come with fanfare. No grand delegation, no red carpets, no official state dinner. Just a modest jet that landed quietly on a remote airstrip east of Ouagadougou 2 hours after sunset. No logos, no press releases. The few who noticed its descent assumed it was military. They weren't entirely wrong, but not for the reasons they thought. From the plane stepped 6 people, all in simple dark suits, no visible rank, no ostentation. Engineers, economists, one former diplomat. They carried no entourage, no bodyguards, just one thin black folder held by the eldest among them, a man whose glasses never left his face and whose Mandarin barely needed translating. The folder was labeled in English, French, and Chinese, Complete Sovereign Infrastructure Proposal. They were escorted, not to the public palace, but to a side chamber inside the presidential compound, where Traoré waited with his closest economic advisors. The room was bare, no national flags, just a single table, dim light, and 3 pitchers of filtered water. The Chinese lead delegate placed the folder in the center of the table, adjusted his glasses, and spoke quietly, but with certainty. "We understand that what you seek is not aid, not debt, but independence." Traoré didn't nod. He simply opened the folder. The first page held 3 headlines. 1. Modular refinery, 90 days to functionality. The proposal was simple yet profound. A fully containerized, rapidly deployable oil refinery capable of refining up to 25,000 barrels per day, designed to operate off-grid using solar-assisted power. All parts would arrive by rail from Togo through discreet freight. No military escorts needed. Installation teams would be mostly local, trained on site by a Chinese engineering corps. You will never again need to ship crude oil abroad for processing, the delegate said. You will refine your own, you will price your own, and the profits will stay in Burkina Faso. Traoré flipped to the next section. Second Independent Gold Valuation Framework. For decades, Burkina Faso had relied on foreign auditors and European market indexes to value its gold, despite it being the country's #1 export. This new framework offered a radical shift, an on-site digital valuation center powered by blockchain verification and audited by a new coalition of non-Western economists. The system would free the state from relying on Swiss banks or Canadian brokers to determine what its gold was worth. You mine it, you own it, you say what it's worth, said the delegate. No more third-party permission. Traoré's expression didn't change, but the stillness in the room deepened. He turned to the third section. 3. Digital trade settlement. Yuan over dollar. The final piece was both the most ambitious and the most dangerous, a currency decoupling mechanism. By integrating into the Chinese digital yuan platform, Burkina Faso could bypass the CFA franc, the Eurozone, and the US dollar entirely. Every energy transaction, gold contract, and infrastructure payment could now be settled in yuan, directly with Chinese or allied banks, outside SWIFT, outside IMF scrutiny, beyond the reach of Western sanctions. No interest rates, no forced economic reforms, only one condition, the delegate said, finally closing the folder. Mutual respect. A long pause settled over the room. Traoré leaned back slightly in his chair. He didn't smile, but for the first time that night, his fingers stopped tapping the table. Then he looked at his finance minister. How fast can we audit the current gold contracts? 2 weeks? Do it in 4 days. He turned back to the delegate. You'll have your answer by Friday. There was no handshake, not yet, just a nod exchanged between two men who understood what was at stake. Not just oil, not just numbers, but the entire system of post-colonial extraction. The Chinese team rose. They collected the folder and walked out as quietly as they'd arrived. Within hours, a new communications line was opened between Ouagadougou and Shanghai. Not under the banner of global partnership, not draped in slogans, just a link, direct and quiet, from one sovereign capital to another. The West wouldn't hear about the offer until it was too late, because in a world built on leverage, the most dangerous thing a small country can do is stop asking for help and start choosing its terms. The desert air was thick with dust and the smell of jet fuel as the Ilyushin Il-76 touched down under the cloak of night. There were no runway lights, no landing beacons, only a narrow strip of tarmac hastily cleared at a covert military airbase deep in Burkina Faso's eastern plateau. The sound of the engines was low, guttural, and strangely calm, like a giant beast purring before battle. Inside the cockpit, no one spoke. Everything had already been set in code, in silence, in timing. On the ground, 2 Burkinabe armored vehicles waited with engines idling, their lights off, their commanders wordless. This wasn't an arrival. It was a transfer of knowledge, sealed by the gravity of everything that had come before. As the cargo ramp lowered, the shadows shifted. Out came the crates, stacked 3 high, marked only in Cyrillic and military code. Inside, drone jamming arrays, electronic warfare kits, EMP-shielded relay units, and modular anti-surveillance towers designed to be deployed and operational within 6 hours. No heavy armor, no flash, just tools, precision tools made for countries with no margin for error. A few steps behind the crates, 7 men descended, all dressed in subdued field gear. No unit patches, no flags. Their leader was a tall, stone-faced colonel with pale gray eyes and a voice that barely needed to rise. Colonel Mikhail Orlov. He stepped onto the tarmac and paused, as if to take in the air, as if to read the ground like a map. Then he walked toward the nearest Burkinabe officer and spoke in slow, clear French. "We're not here to stay. We're here to teach you how to make them leave." The officer nodded, then stepped aside. Orlov and his team were taken not to a hotel, not to a military base, but to a repurposed underground command school, a facility dormant since the last regime, now stripped bare and reconfigured for something else. Sovereignty training. There were no cameras, no translators. The Russian instructors spoke in hand signals, in schematics, in maps drawn in dust. The training began before dawn. One unit learned to isolate hostile drone signals within 3 seconds, triangulate position, and deploy scramblers. Another team practiced rapid deployment of mobile jamming towers, designed to mask movements of military convoys. In a locked room, communications officers studied resilience protocols, how to operate when all satellites went blind, how to transmit orders without a single word escaping enemy ears. What stood out most wasn't the gear, it was the posture. The Russians didn't bark orders. They observed, corrected, demonstrated. They were advisors, not commanders, and that distinction mattered. They came not with superiority, but with memory, the understanding of what it meant to be encircled, to be underestimated, to hold the line when no one else would. In one corner of the base, Traoré watched through a surveillance feed, arms folded. He said nothing, but his expression held something close to gratitude and something closer to calculation, not submission, coordination. By the end of the third night, the Russian team handed over 3 mobile command tablets, each with offline defensive protocols keyed only to Burkinabe fingerprints. Colonel Orlov placed one tablet on the command table and looked up. "This won't make you stronger," he said, "but it will make your enemy weaker." He didn't wait for applause. He simply turned and left the room, leaving behind a nation slightly harder to touch and far more dangerous to underestimate. In the skies above, Western satellites continued their pass, scanning for armored columns and missile trails. But the real weapons had already landed, and they weren't made of steel. They were made of signal, silence, and will. The usual phone calls never came. No IMF delegates requesting a stabilization review. No World Bank envoys suggesting technical adjustments. No Western think tanks offering neatly worded policy papers on inclusive transition strategies. Burkina Faso had gone quiet, at least in the ways that usually made powerful people feel comfortable. And that silence was deafening in the corridors of global finance. At the IMF's regional office in Dakar, a junior economist stared at an empty calendar where a meeting with Burkina Faso's finance minister should have been. The last email sent by the fund had been marked seen, but never answered, not refused, not debated, just ignored. In Washington, advisors to 3 G7 finance ministers drafted memos with increasingly frantic titles. Burkina's sudden decoupling, risk of precedent, threat of yuan-based settlements in the Sahel, post-dollar oil, assessing the unthinkable. Inside those reports, one fact kept resurfacing. No one had given Traoré permission to do any of this. And that was the point. He wasn't seeking approval, not from lenders, not from economists in glass towers, oceans away. Burkina Faso was running now on something rare and combustible, a mix of African will, Eastern infrastructure, and unapologetic, unfiltered sovereignty. With Chinese modular refineries weeks from deployment and Russian defense tech being quietly integrated into border networks, the entire economic choreography of dependency had been disrupted. The CFA franc, long a leash masked as currency, was being set aside for digital yuan settlements. Gold, once measured by European metrics, now valued on Burkinabe terms within Burkinabe facilities. And the loans? There were none. No 30-year payback cycles, no hidden austerity clauses, no forced cuts to education or healthcare in exchange for liquidity. One senior economist from the London School of Economics summed it up bitterly during a closed-door briefing. "It's not just a financial shift, it's a philosophical one. They've stopped asking." In Ouagadougou, Traoré sat at a wooden table with his economic team, not in a luxury conference center, but in a former colonial bank building now repurposed as a national resource office. The walls still bore the outlines of French plaques long removed. The new wall art was simple, a map of Africa, crisscrossed not by borders, but by trade routes not dependent on Western ports, currencies, or validation. "From now on," he said, glancing at the map, "we write our own invoices, and we sign them ourselves." There was no applause, just nods, calculations, action. Outside, posters that once carried NGO logos and imported slogans were being replaced by a new phrase, hastily painted by youth collectives on city walls, village halls, and roadside checkpoints. No more permission slips. It became more than a slogan. It became a doctrine. No more waiting for investment grades from agencies in New York. No more sending emissaries to beg for aid in Brussels. No more pretending that sovereignty meant anything if it came with footnotes. And the world? The world stared, some in disbelief, others in admiration, many in fear. Because if a small, landlocked nation like Burkina Faso, scarred by decades of extraction and silence, could stand, coordinate, and pivot without collapsing, then the entire post-colonial operating system was at risk. For the first time, the script had flipped, and the hand holding the pen was finally African. It happened with no broadcasts, no press alert, no journalists lingering at the gates. The capital slept, unaware that history was being redrawn beneath their feet. Only a few faintly glowing streetlights flickered outside the National Assembly, where shadows moved like ghosts beneath the stone columns. Inside, the air was electric but hushed. No cameras, no speeches, no applause, just the rustle of papers, the subtle click of pens, the steady breath of leaders who had gathered not to debate, but to decide. It was 3:42 a.m., a time chosen not for drama, but for silence. The moment before dawn when even spies are tired, when attention falters in foreign embassies and surveillance satellites switch orbits. Traoré sat at the head of the chamber, not in presidential regalia, but in a simple black tunic, sleeves rolled to the elbows, eyes scanning the document before him. Around him were the few who had proven themselves unshakable. Parliamentarians who had stood through threats, through coups, through the long decay of borrowed democracy. A single sheet of paper rested before each delegate. At the top, National Sovereignty Act, Emergency Provision 6.1. At the center, in bold, all oil and gold reserves within Burkina Faso territory are hereby nationalized and permanently shielded from all foreign corporate ownership. No exceptions, no appeals, no extensions. No one raised their hand to object. No one asked for revision. These men and women, many of them weathered by years of playing by the world's rules, had seen what those rules delivered. Decimated budgets, ghost towns near mining sites, the endless cycle of approval seeking. What they held now was not a law, it was a reclamation. The vote was unanimous, not because of fear, not because of politics, because there was no longer any other path forward that didn't lead backward. Once the ink was dry, a quiet flurry of hands set the machinery into motion. Typed letters, each sealed in a red envelope marked Final Notice, were hand-delivered to the embassies of France, the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom. Each letter bore the presidential seal, the signature of the assembly chair, and a closing line that would be remembered far beyond West Africa. Burkina Faso's resources are not up for discussion. They are the property of its people. Within the hour, all gold mining licenses held by foreign entities were revoked. Private airstrips used by Western contractors were placed under military supervision. Corporate energy survey teams, many of whom had operated under advisory titles, were quietly escorted to the border. No arrests, no press. Just exits. At 4:20, a silent convoy moved from the assembly to the national broadcaster's headquarters. A prepared segment was inserted into the morning news cycle. A blank screen fading into the words, "We have signed a new contract with the soil." At embassies, the silence was thunderous. Ambassadors called back to capitals. Intelligence officers scrambled to assess retaliation scenarios. Defense attachés reported that no troop movement had been detected, no bases mobilized, because there was no military parade, no firing of guns, only legislation backed not by tanks, but by total clarity of will. In less than 2 hours, a nation had turned centuries of foreign leverage into paper ash, and no one could stop it without drawing blood. For the first time, Burkina Faso didn't ask for independence. It simply acted as if it had always had it. The ink on the decree hadn't yet dried when the first tweet came. All caps, all fury. Ibrahim just made the biggest mistake of his life. Africa will pay. Donald J. Trump. Within minutes, screens across newsrooms lit up. Stock tickers jolted. Oil futures spiked 3% before stabilizing. In Washington, senior intelligence officials huddled in windowless rooms as chatter surged from Langley to Brussels. The word used in nearly every briefing, contagion. The Pentagon rerouted 2 U.S. naval vessels, shifting their trajectory toward the Gulf of Guinea. Satellites over the Sahel tripled their surveillance cycles, capturing high-resolution thermal data every 6 minutes. Radio silence from Burkina Faso was no longer a nuisance. It was now a strategic threat. In Brussels, NATO issued a Level 3 memo. Strategic instability alert. Non-aligned state escalation. Risk of regional contagion, severe. Diplomats whispered the unthinkable. If Burkina Faso could nationalize its wealth and stand, what if others followed? Mali, Niger, Guinea, already part of the AES, were likely to double down. But Angola, Chad, even Congo, the model was spreading not just in defense, but in doctrine. By noon, the SWIFT network's gatekeepers held a closed-door meeting, reviewing Burkina Faso's remaining access to global banking. A line in their transcript leaked, "We either isolate them or we watch the system unravel." In New York, anchors bristled with urgency. On CNBC, Burkina Faso destabilizes African investment climate. On Fox, radical African leader threatens U.S. oil security. But in Ouagadougou, there were no alarms, no alerts, only a quiet shift in posture. One decree, one action, and now the world was spiraling around it. From Lagos to London, the fire spread fast. But this time, it didn't destroy. It ignited. In Johannesburg, crowds surrounded the U.S. consulate, arms locked shoulder to shoulder, forming a human shield. No chants, no stones. Just quiet, unyielding presence. A single banner hung from the barricade. Touch Burkina Faso, touch us all. In London, members of the African diaspora marched through Hackney with their faces painted in shimmering gold. Children held cardboard signs scrawled with one phrase, "We own our land." Social media platforms swelled with replays of the moment Traoré stepped into the light. Not in military fatigues, but in full traditional Burkinabe attire, embroidered in deep reds and earth tones. No teleprompter, no podium. Just a man holding the Constitution in one hand and the nationalization decree in the other. His voice was calm, his words sharp. "For too long we have been robbed, disguised as rescued. Now that we have found what is ours, they return with open hands and closed hearts." He paused, eyes narrowed slightly. "But I do not negotiate with thieves." The crowd outside erupted, not in violence but in purpose. And somewhere deep within Africa's core, a message etched itself into history. This land is not leased. It is lived. The compound is still. In the early pre-dawn silence, Ibrahim Traoré walks alone into the war room. No aides, no cameras. Just him, the hum of the servers, and the map glowing red with defense grids, gold corridors, and oil routes. He moves his fingers slowly across the wall, from the northern fields to the southern mines, tracing the veins of a country that had for too long bled without feeling. Behind him, his generals wait, silent, ready. Tension lingers like static in the air. He doesn't look back when he speaks. His voice is low, but it cuts through the room. They're not afraid of oil. They're not afraid of gold. They're afraid of us realizing it was always ours. A long breath, a nod. The order is unspoken, but understood. The silence breaks, and the storm begins to stir. No podium, no armed guards, no bulletproof glass. Just Ibrahim standing before a national camera in traditional cloth, holding two things: the Burkinabe Constitution and the nationalization decree. No script, no applause. For decades we were told what to sell, what to borrow, and who we were. They extracted our future and called it aid. But today we sign nothing but our own names, and we bow to no one. He holds up the Constitution. This gave me power. Then the decree. This gave it back to the people. He leans forward, eyes steady. Burkina Faso is not afraid, and I will not bow. The feat ends. But across the continent, Something starts. In schoolyards, bars, churches, buses, people listen. Then they stand. The city was calm. On the rooftop of the presidential compound, Ibrahim Traoré stood alone, watching the horizon. Below, the streets of Ouagadougou flickered with quiet light. Candles in windows, people gathered in silence, some singing softly, others simply watching the sky. From Lagos to Kingston, from Nairobi to Atlanta, his words had traveled faster than any bullet. Street artists painted his face beside oil drums. Students held vigils. Radio stations replayed his speech at dawn. But Ibrahim wasn't celebrating, and he wasn't smiling. Hands behind his back, he whispered to no one, "This isn't the end." Because it wasn't. It was the first breath of something new. A continent no longer waiting, a people no longer begging. And in that quiet moment, as clouds drifted over the Sahel sky, one truth rose with the wind. They feared collapse. But Africa was finally learning how to breathe. Stories like Traoré's remind us that sovereignty is not only a legal status, but a living choice, renewed or surrendered every day. When a small, landlocked nation decides to define its worth on its own terms, it shakes our assumptions about power. For decades, the global economy has treated resources as the birthright of the highest bidder. This narrative flips that script. It shows a community stepping beyond protest into disciplined, solutions-driven action. Women delivering supplies before anyone asked, students running logistics instead of chanting slogans, neighboring states forming a shield without ceremony. What strikes me most is the pivot from dependency to design. Burkina Faso doesn't close its doors out of isolationism. It opens new ones, choosing partners who respect mutual gain over leverage. That shift reframes aid as collaboration and defiance as dignity. It is a reminder that true independence is measured less by the absence of foreign troops and more by the presence of local purpose. Yet the story also cautions us. Declarations are powerful, but they invite storms. Nationalization can inspire, and it can provoke. The real test lies in what follows. The quiet seasons when media attention fades and governance, transparency, and inclusive growth must prove the promise was worth the price. Still, even if the path ahead is uneven, the symbolic impact is undeniable. A continent long spoken for is now speaking in its own tense, its own voice. Friendly question for you. If your hometown discovered it had untapped wealth tomorrow, would you trust outside experts to manage it? Or would you fight for local control, even if that meant facing powerful opposition? I'd love to hear what balance between partnership and self-determination feels right to you. This story is a dramatized narrative inspired by real public figures. Ibrahim Traoré, Donald Trump, and all individuals mentioned are real people whose actions and public personas have shaped contemporary discourse. While the dialogue and settings have been fictionalized for storytelling purposes, the emotions, questions, and issues raised reflect genuine societal conversations. Thank you for watching and reflecting with us. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you think, please consider subscribing to Captain of Truth. We bring real people, real tensions, and real turning points to life, one story at a time. Subscribe now. Your curiosity fuels the next story.